Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Yud Gimel. Today's stuff is sponsored by Gita and David Neufeld in memory of Gita's father, Yosef and Menachem Mendel V'Pesha, Alav Shalom, and his 10th year at site. He cherished his family and Torah and would be so proud of the generations following in his footsteps and adhering to his values and moral compass. Keter Shem Tov Olel Kulam. Today's stuff is sponsored by Harriet Hartman in memory of Moshe Hartman, Zichrono Levacha, and his 6th year at site. He continues to be missed dearly. He would delight in my learning, his children's and his grandchildren's learning, which we'll honor with a family siyum on his yurt site. Today's stuff is sponsored by Monica Steiner in honor of Rabbi David Abraham Kaplinsky, who begins his first pulpit in San Antonio, Texas today. May you find joy and strength in your working community. I'm so proud of you, David, and love you with all my heart. Okay, with that, we'll get started. We started with the Mishnah yesterday on Daf Yud Bet Amud Bet, which basically distinguished between cities that have decorative elements to them and cities that are not decorated. Okay, cities that have, stores that have decorations up and stores that don't have decorative elements up, which again is unclear exactly what this means. And, we obviously immediately think about Christmas decorations and things like that, but it's very different from that, because here what we're going to say is there's a difference between the stores that have we're going to see what the difference is, Reish Lakish versus Rabbi Yochanan. And again, I'll just remind you, there's a big debate what this is talking about. Is this in the time of the holiday, which would then perhaps at least start to make it somewhat similar to Christmas decorations? Again, even though the whole reason for Christmas decorations is very different, it's not particularly idol worship, and it's not for idol worship, even if, someone wants to claim maybe it's somewhat idol worship. But it's not really for the purpose of idols. Whether in certain countries, or areas where there's Buddhas and things like that, whether that would be, there are some places where there's actual Avodah Zarah like this going on. But is this in the time of the holiday? That's what Rashi says. Now, if you say it's in the time of the holiday, then you have a bit of an issue, because why are we distinguishing between stores? Didn't we say you can't do business dealings at all? Right? So Rashi, go back to the first Mishnah, seems to contradict the first Mishnah. The first Mishnah seems to say you can't buy or sell or anything. So Rashi tries to answer the question against him and claims, again, there's different answers brought. I'm not going to go into all the different possibilities, but one of the ways of resolving that is to say that the first Mishnah actually only means buying things, selling things to them. Because again, if you sell them something, they'll be so happy, they'll think they're gods. And here you're buying, which is actually bad for the seller. The seller, okay, now you think if you own a store, aren't you happy to be selling? But on the other hand, there's this approach that selling, you'd rather have an item than money, because money just disappears and the item stays. And we'll come back to this issue later. So that it's actually bad for the seller when you're buying something from them, and therefore it doesn't fit into that category. Again, it's a little difficult to say that, and that's why the Rambam thinks we're talking about when it's not their holidays. And we're talking about just stores that in general have things that are, again, depending on Reish Lakish or Rabbi Yochanan, but somehow connects with idol worship. Okay? And then it could be during the year and specifically not in their holidays. So there's a lot to be said about what exactly the case of this Mishnah is, just as with the previous Mishnah we had. So now we're going to go to the Gemara. Reish Lakish had said the reason is, and we're only talking really about mu'utarot bevered v'hadas, things that are beautiful, have smells to them, because then when the Jew goes into the store, it's not the issue of buying items from them. The issue is the Jew is benefiting from the Avodah Zarah, because these are items that they use, okay, and Rashi calls it tikrovet Avodah Zarah. They use them for their idols, and therefore we can't benefit from anything used from an idol. That's basic, right? Isur on items that are used for idol worship. And he gets that from this pasuk, which actually I didn't mention this before, but lo yidbak b'yadchem umam necherem is in the context of Ir Nidachet. It's actually a Jewish idolatrous city where they all worship idols. You destroy everything, and you can't benefit at all from any of the items in the city, because they were used for idol worship. Now, points out Reish Lakish. This is where we ended yesterday. Nehenehu da'asu. The problem is for the Jew to benefit from the items in the store that are used for idol worship. Aval mahane shari. But if you buy from the Gentile, and that gives them some, right? He doesn't think buying is a problem. He doesn't think it's a problem because I like the way whoever just put that in the chat about you're depleting the inventory. Okay, that's not the issue. Because if you're actually, if you're benefiting them because you're giving them money, that's not an issue. Okay, that's not a problem. He thinks that that's permitted. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, afilu mutarot, and that's why he says, if it's decorated for their idols with fruits and vegetables, that's not a problem. Because those things you're not benefiting from. Okay, even if they're used for idol worship or something, or they're going to serve their idols with them, if you buy stuff in that store, you're not doing anything wrong. Okay, it's only if you're benefiting when you're in the store from the smell. Rabbi Yochanan Amar, afilu mutarot beperot nam yasur. Even if the decorative elements are produce, doesn't matter. Kal v'chomer. He says it's a simple kal v'chomer. If we learn from the Torah that you can't benefit at all from them, neheneh asur, mehaneh lo kol sheken. If you can't personally benefit from it, you certainly can't cause benefit to them. Okay, now, by you buying from them, you're actually causing benefit. Not because you're buying and they're getting money, but because we're going to see this further on, that there's a tax if you have these stores that are decorated. Okay, so let's go back to our Christmas decorations. If we take that, right, there's stores with Christmas decoration, and there's stores with Hanukkah decorations, and there's stores with nothing at all, okay? So let's just assume, right, you're in some place, and there's different kinds of stores. The ones that have the Christmas decorations, again, not that that's Avodah Zarah, I'm just using something in our world that we can understand. The ones that have these particular decorations that we're talking about, that are decorated in a particular way, it's an indicator that they worship idols. And those particular stores, okay, Rashi claims they're either owned by Komarim, or the Komarim take taxes from them. In other words, they're known as the idol worship stores, and they have a sales tax, so to speak. Their sales tax that they're going to charge you goes directly to the temple or to the idol worship somehow. So now, that means you're directly causing benefit to the idol worship. Okay, that's a problem. Rabbi Yochanan says, if you can't smell their spices, then of course it's going to be forbidden to you to actually give them money that's going to go directly to idol worship. Okay, he says it's just obvious. It doesn't say so in the Torah, but it's clear. Meitive. Now we're going to have a difficulty on Reish Lakish, which once we resolve, we're going to actually throw the difficulty back on Rabbi Yochanan. So again, Reish Lakish said we're going to distinguish between different types of stores. Meitive. Rabbi Natan Omer, Yom Avodah Zarah manachet bo et hameches, machrizim v'omrim. Now the main thing you have to remember, Reish Lakish thinks the only issue is to benefit, not to cause benefit to them. Okay? Now, Yom Avodah Zarah monachet bo et hameches. Okay, remember Black Friday, okay? Huge sale day. So there's a day they give no sales tax day, okay? There's a day where they're manachet bo et hameches. They say, right, in Israel, that's like no mom day, okay? So there's a day where they say there's not going to be any sales tax. Now, this day creates a huge problem for the Jews. Why? They're in a catch-22. Because machrizim va'omrim, so the Gentiles, store owners or the komarim who take the taxes, get up and announce, Kol mi shenotel atara v'yaniach b'rosho. If you take this crown, which is, now, what's the problem with the crown? Okay, let's just read it for a minute and I'll explain. If you take this crown and you put it on your head, now obviously it was an idol worship stuff on the crown. So if you take this crown and put it on your head, uberosh chamoro, or on the head of your donkey, lichvod avodah zarah, out of respect for the idol, yinichu lo et hameches. You'll get the tax taken off. It's not like everyone gets no tax day, but if you show deference to the idol, you will be relieved of the tax. V'im lav, and if not, al yanichu lo et hameches. And if you don't do that, well, then you're going to have to pay the sales tax. Now you can see why we're in a catch-22. Yehudi shenimtza sham hayaseh. What's a Jew going to do? Nimtza yaniach. If they put it on their heads, nimtza neheneh. They'll be benefiting from Avodah Zarah, which is clearly forbidden. Now, well, I'll get back to that in a minute, what the exact benefit is. Lo yaniach nimtza mehaneh. If they don't put it on, they'll benefit the Avodah Zarah because they'll pay the tax. So either which way, they're stuck. Mikan amru, from there they said, Hanoseh v'notem b'shuk shel Avodah Zarah, behemat he'akil pirot ksuf v'kelim yerakvu, ma'od u'klei matachot yolechem liyam hamelach. From there they said, anyone who does business in the shuk of the Avodah Zarah on that day, right, which is forbidden because you're going to do something wrong either which way, you get penalized. How do we penalize you? If you have an animal, you have to do akira, which we're going to talk about what that means. Perot, if they're produce, or vessels or clothing, you have to leave them to rot, okay, to get ruined. You can't use them at all. You can't benefit from them. Ma'ot uklei matachot, if it's money or metal implements, which has nothing else to do with them, yolechem leyam hamelech, put them in Yam HaMelech. Okay, throw them into the Dead Sea. Now, that's what we do with things that we have nothing to do with. We have no way to, we can't benefit from them, but they also won't rot. Now, let's just go back to one very interesting line. So let's just remind us why we're here, okay? Why are we here? Because it says you can't benefit and you can't cause benefit. So that's Rabbi Yochanan clearly. But the very interesting issue here is where it says, if you put it on your head, you're going to benefit. Why are you benefiting? So Rashi says, what's this keter made of? Okay, if you ever go to like gan parties in Israel, when someone has a birthday, they always put a keter with flowers on the head. Right? It's very common, crown with flowers. It's got flowers. They smell nice. So you're benefiting from the smell. That's what Rashi says. Now you might have thought, what would you think the obvious is? You're benefiting because if you put it on your head, you won't have to pay the tax. You're benefiting from the discount. Okay, so why doesn't Rashi say that? So Tosfot explains, very interesting Tosfot. It's a very short one, so we'll just read it. If you put it on your head, you'll benefit. So Pehe is Perush HaKantrus, that's Rashi. Rashi explains, Yaniach HaTorah b'rosho, Kantrus is like a notebook, and that's how Tosfot had Rashi in front of him, so he calls it the Kantrus. Yaniach HaTorah b'rosho, v'nimtza nehanem min hareach. So he quotes Rashi, who says it's the smell. Now, you're getting a tax break, right? You don't have to pay tax. Isn't that a benefit? So he says, that's not called a benefit. Why not? It's a fascinating look at this, totally nothing to do with our sugya, but it's super interesting. I mean, it has something to do with our sugya, but it's kind of off on a tangent. The money's yours. You can't call that benefit. If you get a discount, we don't call that you're benefiting from the person who gave you the discount, right? You would think for sure it's a benefit, but it's not a benefit because it's just on paper, really. Nothing's changed. The money's yours, and then the money's still yours. In order for it to be a benefit, you have to get something. Okay, get money from the other person. You didn't get money here. You just got a discount. So it's an interesting way to look at discounts. Now, just to point out, other Rishonim actually say the benefit is the discount from the tax. Not like everybody thinks this way. So, interesting machloket here of the Rishonim. Anyway, back to our topic. So let's just remind ourselves. We have machloket Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish said only nehaneh is forbidden. The Rabbi Yochanan said nehaneh and mehaneh, and benefiting the Avodah Zarah, and which is the tax, we explained. Now we point out that there's an issue here because against Reish Lakish, because this seems to have both directions or the issue. Now we're just going to continue in the Braita, and then we'll get back to the problem in another line. Ezuhu ikur. Now we didn't explain what does it mean. Behemat te'akel haminasher parsotea min arguva ulamata. You cut off the sinews or something at the by the hooves, somewhere under the knee. Okay. Now, or the tendons. So that's now. Obviously, I'm sure you're thinking, how do we do this? Isn't this torture to the animals? What happened to tzaar baalei hayim? You're not allowed to inflict pain in animals. We'll talk about that later. So now we finished with the Braita. Katani mihat. Now it says, again, just to remind you, because it was a long Braita, it says in here, Yaniach nimtza nehaneh, lo yaniach nimtza mehaneh, goes in both directions against Reish Lakish. So Amar Rav Misharshe B'rei Rav Idi, Kasava Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Plige Rabbanan alei Rabbi Natan. So Rav Misharshe brings an answer and he says, Reish Lakish says the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Natan. In other words, notice this Braita was said in the name of Rabbi Natan. And the rabbis disagree. And therefore, Rabbi Natan holds like Rabbi Yochanan's position. And I like the rabbis. Right? And I would like the rabbis who wouldn't think this would be an issue. You can take the sale. Okay? You can don't put the crown on your head, pay the tax. And that's what you would do because paying the tax is not an issue. Now, if we explain it this way, that there's machloket, so then we'd have to say, what would Rabbi Yochanan think? Rabbi Yochanan, savar lo pligi. Rabbi Yochanan would think the rabbis don't disagree with Rabbi Natan because Why would Rabbi Yochanan choose an individual's opinion when it disagrees with the majority opinion? So it must be that the machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, part of the basis of the machloket is, do they think the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Natan, or do they say that this is an undisputed opinion? Now, this is going to create a problem. V'lo pligi, wait a minute, the rabbis don't disagree? We're going to show you a source. From here, we're going to get into another long braita and kind of off track a little bit, but we're going to show another long braita, which seems to show a different opinion, okay, from Rabbi Natan. And then we're going to say, how could Rabbi Yochanan ignore this braita? And in fact, Rabbi Yochanan addresses this braita at the end, which means it's clear Rabbi Yochanan saw this braita. V'hatanya, it says in a braita, you can go to a bazaar or a sale day or something like that of the Ovdei Kochavim. You can buy. Now here you see clearly it's not a problem to be mahaneh, because cause benefit to them, because you can buy all these things from them. You can buy animals, you can buy slaves, right? Male and female slaves. You can buy houses, fields, vineyards. And not only are you allowed to do this, there's all sorts of things you're now allowed to do. You can even write documents about the sales, deeds of sale in their courts. Okay? You might have thought we can only write in Jewish courts. No, you can go to their courts to write the deed of sale. Why? Because you're actually saving these items from their hands. And here already we're starting to get this idea about, that we're going to talk about later, that you're actually, okay, you have to remember, the Gentiles, the Ovdei Kochavim in those days, the pagans, were despised by the Jews, and they probably despised the Jews, which is why they were also despised by the Jews. And the weaker we made them, the better it was for us. So it's like you're saving those things from their hands. That means basically you're taking away assets of theirs, and it's in our best interest to have them weaker with less assets. Okay, it's better for us. And not only that, but if you buy it and then they try to take it away from you and you bring it to a Jewish court, they're not going to accept the Jewish court, so that's why you're allowed to go to their courts, because then otherwise, right, you have no good way to prove that it's yours. Ve'im haya kohen. Now we're going to get into all these kohen halachot. Now, kohen can't become impure, which means theoretically, okay, according to the rabbis, everywhere in Chutz La'aretz is tamei by rabbinic law. So a kohen theoretically shouldn't go to Chutz La'aretz. So haya kohen mitamei b'Chutz La'aretz ladun v'lar eri mahem. If they try to take it away from you and say it's theirs, and you have to go to Chutz La'aretz to deal with it, you're allowed to do that, even though it's forbidden midrabanan to go to Chutz La'aretz because of the tumah, because the rabbis decreed that all places in Chutz La'aretz are tamei, and this is because they were concerned that there were cemeteries that could be dead bones anywhere, and then their Jewish, non-Jewish bodies are matame in other ways. Not most people think not. Oh well, just magamasa by touching it. Anyway, I'm not going to get into all those details. Just like they can go into Chutz La'aretz, they can also, if the whole thing starts happening and the guy's claiming in a cemetery, I don't know why this would happen in a cemetery, but if the fight ensues and the court happens to be in a cemetery, or the judges who are dealing with this, you can even go into a cemetery if you're a Kohen to do this. Okay, Gemara stops the Braita and says, wait a minute. A Kohen is allowed to go into a cemetery to deal with getting back their items from the Gentile? Tuma de'oraita. That's Tuma de'oraita. How on earth could we allow that? Okay. Ella, no, but they didn't mean that. Okay, don't worry. They didn't mean a Kohen could go into a cemetery for these purposes. Ella Beit HaPras D'Rabbanan. Okay, Beit HaPras is a place where there was a grave there. We know there was a grave, and then it was plowed, and we don't know where exactly the bones might be, and then maybe there's bones that are the size of barley, which are going to be forbidden, and there's a concern of going through the entire field only from a rabbinic perspective, because we don't really know where the body is, and we don't really know that you're going to end up coming in contact with, you'd have to touch the bone that's the size of a barley, right? Because if it's that small, it's only mitame b'maga, not be'ohel, like walking over it. Okay, passing over it, which in a regular cemetery, the problem is even just the air above the graves. This would be a problem only if you touched it. The whole thing is rabbinic because we don't know if you're necessarily going to touch a piece or not, a piece of the bone. So once we drop it to rabbinic, we can understand why the Kohen's allowed to do this. Other things you're allowed to do. A Kohen can go to Chutz La'aretz for the following things. This is very interesting. Mitamei lomod Torah v'lisa isha. Okay, if you need to find a good yeshiva, or you need to get married and you can't find a shidduch where you are, you're allowed to go to chutz la'aretz to find a good shidduch. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Matai, there's a good line. When are you allowed to do this? Well, the next line is more interesting, but it starts with Rabbi Yehuda. Bizman she'em motzei lomod, aber bizman she'motzei lomod, ino mitameh. You can only go to chutz la'aretz if you can't find a yeshiva in Israel, but if there's yeshivas in Israel, then don't go to chutz la'aretz. Rabbi Yossi Omer, afilu bizman she'motzei lomod yitameh. Even if there's yeshivas in Israel, you could still go to chutz la'aretz to learn there. Why is that? Lefi she'ein adam zocheh lomod mikol. Not everybody fits with every yeshiva. We all know there's a million yeshivas, there's a million midrashot, there's a million, programs, and every person finds the, universities, right? You find the right place for you, or the place you get into, but also the place that's right for you, and not everybody can learn from everybody. It's not, right? They understood that learning, right, is sometimes dependent on who's teaching it. So it's a good choice about learning, and therefore you could even go to chutz la'aretz, even though there's yeshivas in Israel, because maybe they're not the right place for you. Okay, back to our topic. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, halacha ke Rabbi Yossi. Right, the reason we got to this was really just because of the beginning, okay? But they're just pointing out right now, and this is what I told you in the beginning, Rabbi Yochanan clearly saw this breita because he paskins like Rabbi Yossi specifically about this issue of learning Torah. Okay, that's not important that he paskins like Rabbi Yossi. What's important is Rabbi Yochanan saw this breita. The beginning of the breita said that you can buy animals and you can buy slaves, and you can buy all these things from Gentiles, as opposed to Rabbi Yochanan who said you can't benefit the idol worshippers, so how can you do that? So, and then it must be, right, if we say this is the rabbis versus Rabbi Natan, it's very clear. But if you don't say that, right, if you say the rabbis don't disagree, they clearly disagree because look at this source. Alma pligi, right, from there it's clear they disagree. Rabbi Yochanan, lo olam lo pligi. No, they don't disagree. V'lo kasha, so how do you resolve the contradiction? It's not difficult because kam belokach min hatagal de shakle mechsamine, v'kam belokach mi baalei de lo shakle mechsamine. There's two different scenarios. One is you buy from a storekeeper. Okay, that's what we talked about, the chanuyot. There's stores. The stores pay taxes. But apparently you don't pay taxes when you go to an individual. Okay, there was no tax at first of all, if you go to someone who's selling in their house, the tax collectors might not know of their existence, the Gentile tax collectors. So they don't know this person sells in their house. So basically, if you're talking about buying from someone in their house, that's that last source that talked about you can buy all these things because you're buying from some person who's not passing on any taxes to the Gentiles, and then you're not benefiting them. If you were benefiting them, it would be forbidden. And that's like Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan basically says, this doesn't prove that there's another opinion because it was talking about a different scenario. Okay. Amar. But now that we got into this, we're now going, right, I was thinking about that, Tina, about paying in cash and paying on the books. It does sound a lot like that, although I didn't want to make that comparison because I don't think it's the same thing. It's that the tax collectors basically collected from the stores. It was like a setup that this is where we're collecting our taxes from. Right? Whether it's kind of like they were just paying in cash and not reporting it, or it just wasn't known about, or those weren't the places where they collected from. Just like they only collected from the stores that had decorations and not the ones that weren't decorated. In other words, there were only certain places where they collected taxes from. Although later we're going to come back to this, and maybe there were more. So now that we got into this issue, we're going to get back to the tzaar baalei hayim. So Amar, we're off course because we want to go into some detail that it talked about in the breita that we quoted. So again, if we talk about our structure, machloket Rabbi Yochanan, Reish Lakish, how to understand the Mishnah, why the decorated stores, what the difference is. Is it because you're actually decorated specifically with things that you're benefiting from when you walk into the store smelling them, or the beautiful scents, or is it that it's an indicator that they're giving taxes? And then we had a contradiction to Reish Lakish, which once we resolved by saying, the rabbis disagree with this source, then we say, well, has Rabbi Yochanan deal with that? The rabbis don't disagree. Do they really not? What about this other breita? Sounds like they disagree. Well, that's a different situation. Okay, that's a summary until now. Now we mentioned that if you go against this rabbinic, the Rabbi Natan said, if you end up buying on the day of their sale, or not buying, or, putting on the keter, either which, right, if you end up actually not putting on the crown, and buying, or yes, putting on the crown and buying with the sale price or buying the full price, either which way it's a problem, and we have to do akara to your animal. So we said that means cutting off the tendons on the animal from the knee down by the hooves. Tzaar baalei hayim. Don't worry about tzaar baalei hayim, because sometimes we can override it when there's something else more important. So the pasuk they're quoting is, you can do akara to their susim, to their horses, and that was when Yoshua went to conquer the land with the people. It says that you can do that to basically cause your enemies to be weaker and overcome them. So therefore, you can do it also here as a penalty to the person. We have to penalize the person who did this, who bought it. So the best way to do that is to make the horse and make the animal rendered useless. So that's what we do. So even though there is this issue of tzaar baalei hayim, we're stuck in a quandary, two issues pulling at us, and that's going to outweigh tzaar baalei hayim. Amar. Now we're going to have a different problem with this ikor. Ezu ikor. They're just quoting the Braita. Minasher parsotea minar kuva ulamata, cutting off by the tendons, the tendons by the hooves. Urimini, but wait, this contradicts another source. Now here we're talking about an animal that was purchased from an idol worshiper. In a different sugya, we're going to talk about something else. And we're going to talk about akira be'ema, and the akira is going to be different. And then we're going to have to distinguish between the two cases. Urimini. These are three different types of ways of sanctifying items. We don't sanctify items, not by kekdesh, not by cherim, not by erchin, giving the value of a person. We don't do it nowadays. Why not? Because we have no temple. So what? We could put money aside and say, this is sanctified until the temple is rebuilt, and then I'll use it to buy sacrifices. Well, the problem is, you probably know this in your own house. You might put something away for safekeeping, and somebody finds it, doesn't know what it is. They'll find some money. They'll need some cash one day. Say, oh, there's some cash in an envelope here. I'll just take that and use it. And then, mi'ila, misuse of consecrated property. So, you're not allowed to do it because you're basically creating a situation where someone's going to end up doing mi'ila, right? Which is accidental misuse of consecrated property. We're not worried someone's going to intentionally use it, but we're worried by accident. Now, what if you did it? Now, you're not allowed to. So if you do it, we penalize you. And it's not even just a penalty. It's that we don't want the item around anymore as being sanctified. So what do we do? If it's a behemah, if you said an animal, this animal sanctified, te'akir, you do akara, which we're going to see in a minute what that is. Perot, ksut, vekelim, yarakvu, the same thing. They're left to rot, right? Produce or kelim, vessels, or clothing. Turning out on a bed, ma'ot uklematachot. Now, if they're things that can't be destroyed, yolechem liyam hamelech, you put them in the Dead Sea. Ve'ezu ikor. What is this ikor? Now we're going to see it's not what we saw before. No el delep b'fanav v'himei tamei elav. We've seen this a lot with korbanot, right? You have an animal that can't be sacrificed, so this is what you do. Okay, there were different options, but in the case where you have to leave it to die, like the chatat, that let's say the owner already got redeemed with some other animal, to leave that animal to die. So you lock the door and leave it to die. You don't feed it and it dies on its own. So Amar Abaye, what's the difference? Shanehata mishum bizion kodeshim. The ideal of what we would do to penalize or to render the animal useless would be to basically cut off the tendons by the hooves. But we don't want to do that to an animal that was sanctified. It's a disgrace. You have to treat a sanctified animal with respect. Not that it's most respectful to leave it to die like that, but that's the best way to do it. Okay, the least problematic way. So now they said, what do you mean? I can think of a better way. If you want it to just get killed, why don't you nishchete mishcha? Why don't you just slaughter it? That's the quickest way for it to die. It's a little torturous to leave it in a room until it dies on its own. Atubuli de takala. Okay, we have all these issues pulling at us. On the one hand, we don't want to do anything disgraceful to the animal. On the other hand, if that could cause a problem. If you slaughter the animal, somebody might eat it. Again, they'll see meat. They'll say, oh, I'll eat that meat by accident, not knowing it was sanctified. So that's why we leave it to die. Why don't we just slice it down the middle? Okay, if you do that, it'll die very quickly. So it'll be painless. Relatively, it won't be painless. It'll be a quicker death, which is considered less painful. And nobody will eat it because it'll be obvious it wasn't slaughtered. So Amar Abaye, Amar Krat, V'nitat Stamet Mizbechotam, because it says you have to completely destroy their Mizbechot, their altars. Lo Tasun Ken Lashem Elokechem. And it says in the pasuk you can't do that to God, meaning you can't destroy, slice down, chop down the middle this animal that was sanctified to God. Not allowed to do that because that's what we do to idol stuff. We can't do it to our own sanctified items. Okay, so that's a biased explanation. Rava gives a different explanation. Why we don't do gistra? Rava amar mipnei shenir'eh kematil mum b'kodashim. It looks like you're blemishing a sanctified animal. So the Gemara says, nir'eh mum ma'al yehu. What do you mean it looks like? What bigger blemish is it than chopping slicing the animal down the middle? They say, no, that's hanemilei shebizman shebeit hamikdash kayam v'chazeh la'krava. When the temple is around, that's actually considered a blemish because you're blemishing an animal that could have been sacrificed. This animal is not going to be sacrificed on the altar. Late lamba. It's not actually considered blemishing an animal. It's only looks like you're blemishing a sanctified animal because it is a sanctified animal. It's just since it can't be brought on the altar, there's no problem to put a mum in. The problem is it just doesn't look right. And that's why we don't do gistra according to Rava. But they say, what do you mean? Why is it no different? We're going to make an analogy now. Our animal can't be brought on the altar. Why? Because there is no temple. So we can't sacrifice it. Since we can't sacrifice it, chopping it down, slicing it down the middle is not considered actually putting a mum. It just looks like it. Well, if that's the case, let's make a comparison. If we had the temple around and you had a blemished animal, and you put another blemish in that animal, it's actually forbidden. It's just as forbidden, even though you can't bring that on the altar either. So these two animals are the same. Our animal can't be brought on the altar because there's no temple, and that animal can't be brought on the altar because it's blemished. Now, Rava said, it's not forbidden to put a blemish in this animal because it's not anyway going to be sacrificed. So you would think the same thing would be with the animal that already has a blemish in the time of the temple. But the halacha is, even though it has a blemish already, and even though you can't sacrifice it, it's still forbidden to put a blemish in that animal. So how do we explain that by us? It's only near it. It only looks like it should actually be forbidden. So they say, ba'amum, they're not the same. Ba'amum, nehita lo chaze legufe, ledame chaze. These two cases are not parallel. While it's true that the one nowadays can't be brought on the altar and the blemished one can't be brought on the altar, neither can be brought on the altar as is. However, the blemished animal can be redeemed. We've seen this many times, right? You redeem the animal and then you take the money and you go buy a sacrifice. So its value can actually be brought on the altar. And that's why it's got a higher level of sanctity. And that's why you can't blemish that animal even more. Even though it's already blemished, it's forbidden to blemish it because it has a certain level of sanctity that our animal doesn't have. Our animal, yes, it's sanctified, but since it can't be brought on the altar ever, not its value, not its body, therefore, there's no problem to actually put a mum in. It's just it looks like it, and that's why we don't want to do it. So it's still forbidden to put a mum, but not because it itself is a problem, but because it looks like it. Okay, and that was all just to explain the word that Rabbi uses, looks like you're putting a blemish, and Rabbi didn't say you're actually blemishing the animal, and that's why it's forbidden. So again, this was all to explain, okay, going back. We said, how could ikor mean cutting the tendons, when ikor in a different context means leaving the animal to die in a closed room? From there, we explained there's a difference, because we can't do bizayon kodashim, that's sanctified, and that's why it's different than an item bought from an idol, right? It's almost two sides of, right, the opposite, complete opposite. One is completely sanctified, one is sanctified to some other god, and therefore we treat them differently. And then we just ask, why don't we slaughter it? Well, that's because someone might eat it. Why don't we slice it down the middle? And that's in, then no one will eat it. And either Abai says, what you do to them, you can't do to us, or you can't do for God, sanctified items, and or Rava said, it looks like you're matil mum, and then we had to just explain that. Eshkachei Rabbi Yonah le Rabbi Eli. So now we see Rabbi Yonah finds Rabbi Eli, he's in the entrance to tzaar. So if you remember, that's in Lebanon. Amarle, katane behemate akir. So he says to him, I understand you said behemate akir. By the way, that's a city that has idol worshippers and non-idol worshippers living together. So maybe it makes sense he's asking this question. I understand that in that place. I understand the behemate akir. Eved mai. What if you buy a slave? What do you do to the slave? Do you injure the slave and make the slave not be able to work? So, because again, it's a penalty to the person who bought it, shouldn't have bought it. So now the question is, what kind of Eved are we talking about? Eved Yisrael lo kame baalei. We're not even asking about a Jewish slave. Obviously, you can't inflict a wound in a Jewish slave. But ki kame baalei Eved ovei kochavim mai. Now, hard to swallow this question, but don't worry, you'll be happy with the answer. But they seem to think perhaps we could treat a Gentile differently, and perhaps for a Gentile slave we're allowed to do that. Why are you even asking this question? Okay, you can see it was very, I don't think there's any room for this question. Tanya, it says in a Braita, these are both considered bad people. One is Ovei Kochavim, because remember, the pagans in those days were evildoers. They were often engaged in bestiality and other things, and they weren't, in licentious behavior, all sorts of things. They were considered bad people. And Ro'ei Be'emadaka, this we learned about in Sanhedrin. These are Jews who are shepherds of small animals and take their animals to graze in other people's fields and steal from them. If they fall into a pit, okay, Loma Alim, you don't have to take them out of the pit, but Loma Redim, but you can't put them in the pit. In other words, you can't cause injury to them. You don't have to necessarily save them, okay, because they're bad people, and there's no obligation to save someone who's an evil person, which again is a question of itself, right? Isn't everyone B'Tselem Elokim? And okay, this sugya raises a whole bunch of questions, but at least they say you cannot injure them in any way. You can't put them in a pit, for example. So likewise, you're not allowed to injure that slave, so no, we don't do anything. Amalei Rabbi Yirmiyah Rabbi Zera. Katane lokhim mehem behema avadim ushvachot. Eved Yisrael, or Dilma Filu Eved Ovei Kochavim. So apropos this discussion about slaves, Rabbi Yirmiyah says, we saw in the Braita before, you can buy from them animals, slaves, right? In the case that said you could buy from them, remember if you buy it from the local guy and not the storekeeper, is it an Eved Yisrael that you're allowed to buy, or even an Ovei Kochavim? Now, if you remember, I mentioned this before, and I said we get back to this, you're Matzil Miyadam. The issue is we don't want, right, we want to take these things away from the Gentile, and there's an interest in, we're going to allow you to do this because it's good for you or good for what you're doing. We're going to see right now. So we're going to try to figure all these out. So he says, so is it a Jewish slave or is it a Gentile slave that we're talking about that you're allowed to purchase from them? Eved Yisrael. So he says, Rabbi Zera says, it seems like it would be an Eved Yisrael. Eved Ovei Kochavim l'mayim baalei. Why would it be allowed to purchase a Jew from them? Because you want to save the Jewish slave from being in a Gentile home. He can't keep mitzvot, right? Who knows what the Gentile will do to him? It's saving the person's life, basically. But in Eved Ovei Kochavim, what we're saving the Eved Ovei Kochavim from, right? A Gentile slave from the Gentile owner. Why would we want to do that? That's what's in the interest from our perspective. So Ki'ata Ravin, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, when Ravin came, he said in the name of Reish Lakish, Afilu Eved Ovei Kochavim mipnei shemachniso tachat kafei hashchina. If you remember, the Gentile slave basically becomes part of the Jewish household. Takes on mitzvot, just not time-bound mitzvot, positive commandments. Everything else they take on, and they become like a pseudo-convert. So it's beneficial to that, right, Gentile. This is a bit of a missionary type of thing, that we want to take people away from that world and bring them into the way of God. Amrav Ashi. Atu behema, my machnis tachat kafei hashchina. He says, wait a minute. That doesn't fit with the source. It puts them in the same category as animals. What? Animals? You want to make them Jewish animals? What are we talking about here? Ela mishum miutayu hachanami debimai teishari. He says it's not because of this kafei hashchina issue. He says, what's the issue? And this goes back to the wording, harei kematzil miyadam. I talked about it before, and here they say it straight on, which is we want to minimize their assets. It's better for us if they have less assets. It makes them less strong, makes things better for the Jews. So we're allowed to buy animals because then they'll have less animals. Also, we could buy their slaves because then they'll have less slaves. It's just better for them to have less assets. Again, it's true we're giving the money for it, but the money can be spent on who knows what they'll spend it on. They might waste the money, as opposed to the animals, which are a real asset. Rabbi Yaakov Zavan Sandala. This is a very interesting story. Rabbi Yaakov bought sandalim from a Gentile. Rabbi Yirmiyah Zavan Pita. He bought pitot. Amar lechad lechavre. One said to the other and started criticizing the other. This is when they say people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, right? So, Yatma Avi Rabba Chachi. You orphan. Meaning like you're an orphan because you didn't have a rabbi. What would your rabbi do? What you just did? And Amar le'idach, the other one said to the other, Yatma, Avi Rabba Chachi, would your rabbi do what you did? Like, why are you screaming at me about what I did? You also bought from a Gentile. Now, what was the deal here? Well, Travayim mi baalei zav, and they both bought from not someone who was giving taxes, not a store owner, a merchant. They bought from a regular guy who just happened to be selling. V'chol chav echad savar, each one thought chavre mitagar savar. This is, we have a lot of good phrases here, right? Expressions. Don't, right? You should hevei dam kol adam l'chav zchut. See people with, give them the reason. I'm having trouble with my words. Judge people with the. Can't think of how to say it in English. Someone can help me. But anyway, so basically, we're going to have this case. Each one looked at the other. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Thank you. Each one thought that the other bought from a merchant. To Amar Rabbi Abba Berei to Rabbi Chia Bar Abba, and then it should say Amar Rabbi Yochanan. That's what the Harot say. Lo shanu ela belokach min hatagal. The shakle michsa minei. Ava belokach mi balabayit. Lo shakle michsa minei. Lo shakle minei michsa mutar. This is the exact distinction we made on Avodah Aleph, and now they say in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, which made sense because that's how we resolved the problem against Rabbi Yochanan. There's a distinction between buying from a merchant and buying from a regular person. Okay, because the regular person isn't paying taxes and the merchant is. Amar Rabbi Abba Berei to Rabbi Chia Bar Abba. Ilmalei, now here comes the big end of this sugya. Ilmalei haya Rabbi Yochanan hazimna ba'atra, if he was here in this place, they also take taxes from this. Okay, this is why we talked about before. Maybe people are paying cash or not, but in this place, they're taking taxes from everybody, even if you're selling out of your house. Hava aser. Rabbi Yochanan would have forbidden it also. Ela inu hechizavin. So how did these rabbis buy then? Okay, because they were living now where taxes are being taken. Right? There's basically one generation of difference between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Zarah and Rabbi Yirmiyah, okay, or maybe they were in different places in Israel, I don't know. But anyway, they ask, and they answer me, baalei she'eino kavua zabim. We're now going to say there's three types. There's people, and this you could totally see in our lives, there's stores, there's people who sell in their house, and then there's the random person who might one-off sell you something. Okay, so they bought from a random one-off person, and that's why it wasn't forbidden for them. Because they really don't take taxes because no one even knows they exist. But if they have a business already, then so what if it's in your house or they do it, maybe it's not a business, but they do it often, so the tax collectors know about them. Okay, we'll finish with this Mishnah, which we'll deal with a lot more tomorrow. There's certain things you can't sell to a Gentile because it's clear they use these things for idol worship. And then likely, again, the commentaries disagree a little bit, but it seems like it's lifnei ver lo titei mechshol. You can't put a stumbling block for a blind person. You can't kind of do something that's going to enable them to end up worshiping idols. You're basically making it easy for them to worship the idols. It's true balin. Okay, we're going to see what all these things are tomorrow. Benot shuach, totarot, livona, v'tarnagol halavan. Okay, so the benot shuach are white dates. It's true balin. We're going to see in the Gemara tomorrow, and totarot I think is also going to come up what they are. I think we'll get there tomorrow. We'll define it then. The levona is the frankincense, and the tarnagol halavan is a white rooster. So a white rooster apparently was something they sacrificed. Rabbi Yehuda Omer mutar them korlo tarnagol lavan beina tarnagolim. If you sell them a whole bunch of roosters and there happen to be some white ones mixed in, that's okay. You just can't sell only white roosters. Okay? Ubizman shehu bifnei atzmo. And if you are going to sell a white rooster, koteat etzba'o machorlo. Cut off its finger. Again, we have this tzaar baalei hayim issue, but better that than worship Avodah Zarah, or cause someone to worship Avodah Zarah. Cut its finger off, because once you cut its finger off, they're not going to bring an animal that's missing its finger, or a bird in this case. Ushar kol advarim stama mutar. But everything else, any other item you sell, if they don't specify why they're buying it, it's permitted. Upirushan asur. But if they say, I'm buying this to offer to my gods, then you can't sell it to him, right? Like you hear them in the store saying, I'm going to bring this to my idol, and great. Can't do that. Rabbi Meir Omer, he adds a few more to the basic list. Omer af dekaltav v'chatzav v'niklav asur l'mkor lovdei kochavim. Okay, so he adds a bunch more things. It says also they worship these things. They use these for idol worship, and therefore they're forbidden as well. Okay, we'll get back to this Mishnah tomorrow, and we'll deal with it much more in depth. So, quick summary, even though we've been summarizing it along the way. We had Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan disagreeing about the Mishnah. From that, we had a difficulty on Reish Lakish, which we flipped on its head, turned it to Rabbi Yochanan, and then resolved it according to Rabbi Yochanan as well. Then we had we went into detail about the ikor, and how does that contradict? Why does it contradict the source about ikor for animals that were sanctified these days? And then we described the differences, and from there we got into some other things about the ikor there, and and why we don't do something else to it, like chop it, in the middle. Then we had the story of the question about an eved. We do ikor by an eved also. We said definitely not. And then we basically went into these two rabbis who each looked at each other and said, how'd you do that? And then we described how they could do it. And then even nowadays, right, we described that there's really three categories of cases: store owners, house owners who sell, and house owners who sell once in a blue moon. Okay, and then we went to this list of things that you can't sell to a Gentile because lifnei ivra lo titei machshol. That's it for today. Wishing everyone a good day.